Fire Marshal with the Woodside Fire Protection District, and I have the great pleasure today of presenting to you some very boring code language. No offense to you, Crystal. I know it's just the nature of the beast that we deal with, and I apologize. It's probably going to be a lot like reading a book to you today, but like I said, it's the nature of the beast. You can't paraphrase and abbreviate some of this stuff if you want people to try to understand it. So I'll begin with a brief background, and then we'll move into what we adopted and came up with on December 8th when it was voted in. And we'll kind of show you on some tables what it all means. And so let me go ahead and share my screen. All right, so the Portola Valley Ignition Resistant Building Code Amendment. The town of Portola Valley exists within a region where, of course, the land use patterns transition between essentially unoccupied lands to areas of more intense development. Areas in this region are prone to wildfires due to the presence of increased vegetation alongside geological features that could increase fire intensity and development, including homes. Recognizing the dangers of wildfires, the town has addressed these concerns historically in the following ways. So they have participated in the local Fire Safe Council. They maintain a wildland urban interface WUI code, including the building code amendments that led to Chapter 7A for the entire community, not just the areas designated by CAL FIRE as very high fire severity zones. So at the time when CAL FIRE said that you need to apply Chapter 7A to the very high fire severity zones, the town chose to just blanket the entire Portola Valley with the Chapter 7A building code requirements, which, as we know today, we've learned that Chapter 7A is not enough. It needs to be more than that, and that was one of the things that we were trying to get into this code. Also, the adoption of a safety element addressing wildfire issues, the adoption of a hazard mitigation plan, and they have a strong relationship with us here at Woodside Fire Protection District, and then, of course, the whole prohibition of fireworks. As climate change has affected weather patterns and the environment, the risk of wildfires has greatly increased in Northern California. We all know that. And recent notable wildfire-related activities include the CZU Lightning Complex fire in August and September of 2020, which destroyed 925 residences, damaged 90 residences, and threatened more than 3,800 other structures. A 2018 San Mateo County grand jury report on the risk of wildfires in parts of the county included Portola Valley. The inclusion of portions of the town in the Public Utility Commission's CAL FIRE developed very high fire severity zone, which has led to an active enhanced vegetation management effort by PG&E around its power infrastructure, and increased non-renewals and some steep price increases for fire insurance for our residents, and an increase in annual red flag days. On April 10th, 2019, the Town Council created the Ad Hoc Wildfire Preparedness Committee to address outstanding wildfire resiliency issues. Its charter, adopted in May 2019, stated the following: given the inherent risk of wildfire in Portola Valley and the changing character of wildfires due to climate change, the Ad Hoc Committee on Wildfire Preparedness shall advise the Town Council on a limited duration basis on ways to reduce wildfire danger and increase resident resiliency in a wildfire emergency. So the committee delegated its work to 3 subcommittees. The first one was communications, evacuation, and outreach. The second was home hardening, insurance, and infrastructure backup. And then the third was vegetation management and defensible space. The 3 subcommittees met multiple times. We had a lot of meetings about this, many times with outside partners and experts, and prepared a list of short, medium, and long-term recommendations for the council's consideration. At their October 21st, 2019 meeting, the committee finalized their initial recommendations to the council, which were adopted at the December 11th, 2019 council meeting. Among the recommendations were a set of home hardening building code amendments. The town utilized the services of a consultant building official to develop the initial language, then switched to another consultant building official to complete the process in a manner more in line with the town's needs. The proposed ordinance includes the subcommittee recommendations and are intended to help mitigate the risk of loss to life, buildings, and property. The town's consultant building official worked closely with the Woodside Fire Protection District Fire Marshal on this ordinance. Representatives from the Community Assistance for Wildfire also reviewed the ordinance and provided feedback. CPAW is a group out of Bozeman, Montana that works closely with Headwaters Economics. They're actually a part of Headwaters Economics. And I applied for a grant with them to help us with our wildfire resiliency throughout the fire district. And so we were accepted on that grant. We're working with them now through the end of 2022. And so we did consult with them on this when we put this together. That's just a little bit of background on CPAW. The current state codes require wildfire hardening, enhanced fire resistance measures for new buildings in specific locations, including the very high fire hazard severity zones. And these are mostly contained in materials and methods for exterior wildfire exposure in Chapter 7A of the 2019 California Building Code, and in sections R337 of the 2019 California Residential Code. So previous Portola Valley Code amendments. The town of Portola Valley adopted local amendments to the building code in 2009 to enhance wildfire hardening that expanded requirements townwide and also applied to certain alterations and additions to existing buildings. These generally require townwide application of Chapter 7A for all new buildings, application to some alterations to existing buildings, a requirement for fire sprinklers in almost all buildings, Class A roofs, ignition-resistant exterior walls, and gas shutoff valves. The proposed building code amendments would amend the town's building and residential codes to apply new requirements as recommended by the Wildfire Preparedness Committee and exceed standard building codes, incorporating lessons learned in analyses of recent wildfires. So the ordinance language amends the applicable sections of the California Building Code and California Residential Code to clarify application in both residential and non-residential buildings and enhance enforceability. So the new local amendments are generally as follows. Clarify and add enhanced wildfire hardening measures for all new buildings, additions, alterations, and repairs to existing buildings, resulting in enhanced fire resistance of both existing homes and existing neighborhoods over time. Clarification of the town's current 50% rule for when these measures apply to include a calculation for additions with alterations. Prohibition of wood shake and shingle roofs, even if they are treated. Clarification and elimination of combustible exterior wall coverings. So wood shingle and wood siding would not be allowed. The elimination of the option of using 1/16 inch mesh openings in lieu of more effective listed ember resistant vents for attics and underfloor spaces. The addition of requirements to protect the underside of deck structures with non-combustible exterior enclosures when the deck is 4 feet tall and lower. The addition of requirements for decking material, the walking surface, to be non-combustible, and requirements for non-combustible fences and gates within 10 feet of the home, non-combustible gazebos and similar structures within 50 feet of a home, and trellises within 50 feet of the home that are over 120 square feet in area. So these are kind of the 6 things that that Denise and Crystal were talking about when we're talking about the development of these home hardening and defensible space codes. The proposed ordinance contains some significant changes to the existing ordinance. The most notable are discussed in more detail below. The first section describes the changes to how the home hardening measures are applied as recommended by staff. And then the second section describes the changes recommended by the Wildfire Preparedness Committee and how they have been integrated. And then in the back, I'm going to show you some tables. That would be the attachments that include a table outlining the recommendations of the Wildfire Preparedness Committee and how they've been addressed. So, application of the code that is staff recommendation. The town's current code requires existing structures that undertake an addition, alteration, or repair to the existing building or structure within any 12-month period that affects 50% or more of the exterior wall plane surface or affects 50% or more of the floor area to comply with the provisions of the California Building Code, Chapter 7A. This is commonly called the 50% rule and is the trigger for the whole building to be brought up to the standards of Chapter 7A. So when this threshold is reached, the building is treated as a new building. The current town code also specifies certain circumstances where a project does not trigger the 50% rule, but certain building elements are required to meet Chapter 7. And those include repairs to or replacement of roofing that exceeds 25% of the roof area, comply with the roof requirements of Chapter 7A. Exterior siding that exceeds 10% of the existing area of siding, comply with the exterior siding requirements of Chapter 7A. And replacement of windows, doors, and skylights need to comply with the windows, doors, and skylights requirements of Chapter 7A. More staff recommendation. The current code language provides specifications for how the 50% rule is calculated. As currently written, the wall plane surface to be included in the calculation of the 50% are walls where the studs in the wall have to be removed or stripped bare such that one can see through the wall. And then the floor area to be included in the calculation of the 50% is the floor area for all rooms affected by structural changes. The current language does not clearly define its application for projects that include both additions and alterations to existing homes, where neither exceeds the 50% wall or floor area thresholds. So the proposed ordinance includes revised language intended to provide greater clarity for property owners, design professionals, and builders for determining if a proposed project will require the entire building to comply with all of the provisions of the ordinance. The proposed ordinance specifies the following. Interior and exterior walls are included in the wall plane surface calculations. The floor area of all additions, rooms affected by an addition, and structural modifications to an existing building are included in the floor area calculations. And then additions that include interior alterations where the combined percentage of affected floor area and affected wall area exceeds 50%. And when existing buildings exceed any of the above thresholds, they are treated as new buildings. So we're going to capture more projects with the new code language. The inclusion of interior wall plane area to the calculation is intended to address major remodels to buildings that currently do not trigger the requirements of the ordinance. As an example, a project where there are only minor structural changes being made, the exterior material is all removed and all of the interior drywall is removed such that one can see through the interior walls would not trigger the requirements of the ordinance or the installation of fire sprinklers under the current language. This is due to the studs on both sides of the exterior walls not being exposed such that one can see through the wall. Therefore, they are not included in the wall plane calculation and do not trigger the provisions of the ordinance. Additionally, any walls being demolished that are not load-bearing are not structural changes. Therefore, they too do not trigger the provisions of the ordinance. However, the inclusion of interior wall plane area to the calculation for this project would most likely trigger the home hardening and the fire sprinkler requirements because the total exposed interior wall plane would exceed 50% of the total interior and exterior wall plane area. So the differentiation between the exposure of studs for interior and exterior walls will result in more wall area plane affected, due to the requirement for the inclusion of exterior walls where the studs are exposed on one side as opposed to both. The proposed ordinance also provides a methodology for calculating the overall percentage of floor area, wall plane area, and a combination of both to be applied to additions with alterations, including structural changes. So under the current ordinance, the addition, since it is new construction, would have to comply with all of the provisions for a new building, and the alteration would have to comply with the specific provisions applying to any new windows, doors, siding, and roofing being installed in the existing building, but not the remainder of the existing building. The additional language is intended to capture projects where neither the addition nor the alteration exceeds the 50% threshold. However, the project scope is significant enough to warrant the entire building being brought into compliance with the requirements for home hardening and fire sprinklers. The potential impact of the new language will be that more projects will have to comply with the home hardening requirements and fire sprinklers, which will add cost to the project. Additionally, by treating these projects as new buildings, they will have to comply with the Woodside Fire Protection District's Ordinance Number 12, which includes requirements for driveways to provide better fire access to buildings. Staff is also recommending these changes so that more projects that include major renovations and additions would be required to comply with the home hardening measures. Given the property values in the community, these projects are typically large in scale and have high construction costs. And as such, staff finds it reasonable for these projects to upgrade all materials to meet the higher safety standard. So now here's the Wildfire Preparedness Committee recommendations. The majority of the proposed amendments address the Wildfire Preparedness Committee recommendations. The amendments that will have the most significant impacts are the requirements for Class A roof coverings with the prohibition of wood roofs, non-combustible exterior wall coverings or siding, and the enclosed roof eaves. The current town ordinance allows for ignition-resistant materials for roofs and siding. Ignition-resistant material is defined in the code as a type of material that resists ignition or sustained combustion sufficiently so as to reduce the losses from wildland-urban interface conflagration under worst-case weather and fuel conditions with wildfire exposure of burning embers and small flames. The Wildfire Preparedness Committee specifically recommends non-combustible materials for these applications. Non-combustible means a material in the form in which it is used is material of which no part will ignite and burn when subjected to fire or per laboratory performance testing as prescribed in the codes. Additionally, the codes specify that the material cannot be subject to increased combustibility or flame spread index through the effects of age, moisture, or other atmospheric conditions. The removal of the allowance of ignition-resistant materials is consistent with town's proactive approach for enhanced wildfire prevention. So what is a Class A roof covering? Class A roof coverings are typically asphalt, shingle, clay, tile, slate, and metal roofs. The existing town code amendment requires Class A roofs, the highest rating, and then the state code makes an exception to allow fire retardant wood shakes and shingles, which are more combustible. The proposed amendment would remove that exception, making wood shakes and shingles no longer would be allowed. Fire retardant shingles are designed to delay the fire from entering the building, but do not have the same resistance to fire as Class A roofs. So this added requirement would not only better protect the occupants from the fire, but also protect neighborhoods from fire spread. Small re-roofs, less than 25% of the roof area, are exempt to not deter people from doing routine maintenance and repairs or for getting permits for that type of work. What is non-combustible siding? Non-combustible siding is typically stucco, metal, masonry, or fiber cement products like Denise was talking about earlier. The use of non-combustible siding prevents fire from penetrating through horizontal and vertical lap joints between individual pieces of siding into the stud cavity and then into the interior of the building. This requirement does potentially pose limits on architectural styles. However, there are a wide selection of non-combustible siding which look and install similar to wood, including board and bat, shingles, lap siding that will easily accommodate ranch and craftsman and modern architectural styles. These products have been on the market for over 2 decades and are cost competitive to wood. Roof eaves and overhangs. Roof eaves and overhangs of buildings are vulnerable to fire and embers which can congregate in this area of the structure. The current California Building Code and Residential Code allow for open eaves, and the rafter tails are not required to be protected if they are 2 feet or larger. An enclosed roof eave constructed with non-combustible material, ignition-resistant material, or a 1-hour fire assembly prevents the ignition of the combustible roof deck and the rafter tails. So the proposed ordinance prohibits open roof eaves and deletes the allowance for the roof eave enclosures to be a 1-hour assembly. These requirements result in all roof eaves being enclosed and the enclosure being constructed from non-combustible or ignition-resistant materials. There is an exception for gable end overhangs and roof assembly projections beyond an exterior wall, other than that at the lower end of the rafter tails. The exception recognizes that the higher the roof eave or gable end is above a ground fire, the less likely it is to ignite. This exemption is consistent with the California Building Code, California Residential Code, and National Fire Protection Association standards for reducing structure fire hazards from wildland fires. That's in NFPA 1144. These requirements potentially add costs to projects and affect architectural styles. The added cost associated with enclosing roof eaves for an existing home that triggers application of the ordinance may be significant. The process of enclosing roof eaves in areas that are not part of the actual addition alteration can be challenging depending on the type of siding and may potentially require cutting into the existing water-resistant barrier. The existing water-resistant barrier on older buildings can be fragile due to the age, and making modifications to it can cause unseen tears that can lead to leaking and dry rot over time. The council was made aware of these potential challenges in implementing this requirement. So the cost to enclose eaves for newly constructed buildings is less of a percentage of the overall cost. The enclosure of roof eaves is not typical to certain style architecture, including ranch and craftsman styles. And the enclosure of roof eaves on existing ranch or craftsman style buildings will change the architectural look of the building. So that was something that they had to take into consideration, but they still chose to go with the recommendations. Ventilation openings. Ventilation openings can be designed to prevent embers from entering structures through attic and foundation vents. To accomplish this, the vents should be wildland flame and ember resistant WUI vents. The town's current ordinance applies the requirements of the California Building Code, Chapter 7A, and Residential Code, Section R337, to all new buildings and additions and alterations and repairs to existing residential buildings when the scope of work exceeds the town's 50% rule, which means WUI vents are currently required. So no big changes there. As far as the immediate implementation, staff and the Wildfire Preparedness Committee have recommended the ordinance be implemented on an emergency basis under Government Code Section 36937B. This recommendation is because climate change has extended the wildfire season and increased its unpredictability. Further, the new state housing legislation adopted new legislation, especially SB 9, which is expected to increase the number of housing applications in town, further exacerbating the need for additional home hardening measures. What would the fiscal impacts of the amendments on the homeowners be? Implementation of this ordinance will increase costs for many projects, no doubt about it, particularly for existing homes. For a new building, the cost increase is not significant. For replacing a roof, it may add a few $100s. For window replacements, it could add about 10% to the construction costs. A 2017 report by the National Institute of Building Sciences estimated a savings of $4 for every dollar of additional construction cost by implementing the International Wildland Urban Interface Code at the community scale. And there are no costs to the town associated with adopting these building code provisions. So here's a summary of the code amendments on a table. The staff recommendation updated the 50% rule for application of amended code sections. So the current code requirements, additions and alterations that exceed 50% of existing floor area or wall area in a 12-month period are defined as new buildings. So the proposed amendments to code requirements, additions and alterations that exceed 50% of the existing floor area or wall area in a 12-month period are defined as new buildings, and additions with alteration where the combination of the percentage of affected floor area and wall area exceed 50% of the existing floor area or wall area in a 12-month period are defined as new buildings. And that's both for non-residential and residential buildings. The effects of the changes: it maintains town current definition for large additions and alterations as new buildings. It establishes the definition for additions with alterations where the addition is less than 50% of the existing floor area and the alterations affect less than 50% of the existing wall area as new buildings when the combined percentage exceeds 50%. The new building definition applies to the installation of automatic fire sprinklers, the application of the requirements of the California Building Code, Chapter 7A, and the residential code section, and the Woodside Fire Protection District's requirements for new buildings. The Wildfire Preparedness Committee recommendation for modifying building codes to require non-combustible material and prohibit shake roofs. So this current code, Class A or higher roof coverings, the proposed code amendment would include two things. The roof must be Class A, and wood shake and shingles are prohibited. No more wood shake and shake shingles, even if they're treated. It applies to non-residential and residential buildings. The effects of the changes: prohibits wood shakes and shingles for all buildings and maintains the allowance to install asphalt shingles. So those are still allowed. And the project amendments apply to new buildings, additions, alterations, and repairs that exceed the 50% rule, and re-roofs that exceed 25% of the roof. And now we're going to talk about the Wildfire Preparedness Committee's recommendations for attic and foundation vents. There aren't really many changes here. WUI vents are currently required by ordinance for all new buildings and residential additions, alterations, and repairs that exceed the 50% rule. All right, so no changes there. The wood decks, as per the Wildfire Preparedness Committee's recommendations, current code requirements: the underside of decks shall be enclosed to grade, or the underside of the exposed underfloor shall be protected in accordance with the requirements of this chapter. The proposed amendments to the code requirements requires non-combustible material shall be used for the decking material on all decks, and the structure of exterior decks shall be enclosed from the underside of the deck to grade with solid, non-combustible, or ignition-resistant material per 703A of the California Building Code. So decks that are 4 feet or lower need to be enclosed with some kind of a non-combustible material. That applies to non-residential as well as residential buildings. The effects of the changes: maintains the current code requirements for porches, balconies, and stairs to be constructed with one of the following materials: either non-combustible or ignition-resistant material, exterior fire-treated wood, materials that comply with a series of test standards and based on whether or not an attached exterior wall covering is ignition-resistant or non-combustible. It also establishes the requirements for decking material to be non-combustible on all decks, and it requires protection for the underside of the deck surface to be protected with non-combustible or ignition-resistant materials for decks that are 4 feet or lower to the ground. It applies to all new decks, whether freestanding or attached to a building, and replacement of decking materials. And this one applies to attached buildings, as per the Wildfire Preparedness Committee's recommendations. Current code requirements, minimum code requirements of Chapter 7A for all new accessory structures that require a permit, and additions, alterations, and repairs to existing accessory structures that require a permit and that exceed the 50% rule. The proposed amendments to the code make the following changes. Accessory structures and attached miscellaneous structures or detached miscellaneous structures that are installed at a distance of less than 50 feet from an applicable structure shall be constructed of non-combustible materials or ignition-resistant materials. Fences and gates located within 10 feet of an applicable structure shall be non-combustible. That applies to non-residential as well as residential buildings. The effects of the change requires all accessory structures within 50 feet of the primary building to be non-combustible exterior walls, Class A or non-combustible roofs, plus other amendments may apply. Requires fences and gates located within 10 feet of a building to be non-combustible, and allows fences and gates located more than 10 feet of a building not required to comply with the provisions of the California Building Code 7A or the residential code. And this applies to projects that are all new accessory structures, additions, alterations, and repairs to existing accessory structures that exceed the 50% rule. And this one has to do with the siding as per the Preparedness Committee's recommendations. Under current code, exterior walls must be non-combustible or ignition resistant. Proposed code, exterior walls must be non-combustible, so the ignition resistant goes out the window. It applies to non-residential as well as residential. The effects of the changes removes the allowance for ignition resistant wall coverings, log walls, and architectural trim. And it applies to new buildings, additions, alterations, and repairs that exceed the 50% rule, alterations to existing exterior wall coverings that affect less than 10% of the exterior building. We're talking about gaps in open eaves. So the current code, as per the Wildfire Preparedness Committee recommendations, new buildings, additions, alterations, and repairs that exceed the 50% rule, the minimum code requirements of Chapter 7A applied. Under the proposed code, open roof eaves with the underside of a combustible roof deck exposed are not permitted. That's for both non-residential and residential. The effects removes code allowance for open roof eaves, allows exceptions for gable end overhangs and roof assembly projections beyond an exterior wall other than at the lower end of the rafter tails, and ignition-resistant fascia and other architectural trim boards. That applies to new buildings, additions, alterations, and repairs that exceed 50%. And this one discusses the proposed code as per the Wildfire Committee for glass windows and skylights. Under the current code, exterior windows must be minimal.
Let's go, buddy. Hey,
minimum dual pane with one tempered pane of minimum 20-minute fire rating. Under the proposed amendment, no proposed changes to existing state code requirements. So there's really no changes here. We're still requiring the same as we did with Chapter 7A. I thought there was one change, though. I think there was with I think they're requiring metal mesh screening on skylights that open up. Let's see if I can find that in here. Yeah.
It's at the bottom, Don, number 5.
Number 5, yeah, number 5. So the only change, I think, is the number 5, where there's a non-combustible metal mesh screen for operable skylights. Otherwise, everything's pretty much the same as Chapter 7 requires. And that's it. So, you know, I apologize for the wordiness of this, but, you know, when you're talking about code language, it's very difficult to paraphrase and to abbreviate because I think people that aren't in the code and aren't regularly using code language have a tendency to lose focus and lose track. You got to keep everybody on task, and that's what I was trying to do. So I hope that made sense to everybody. And if you have any questions, feel free to ask.
Yeah, I mean, my only comment is what the town planner used in terms of her cost analysis. And that's something that when a city adopts a building code and they're making it more stringent than the model code, they actually in their staff reports usually have to add in the financial factors. She was using 2017 data, and CPAW has clearly come out and it's really starting to be widely used now. The fact that, and Crystal affirmed this, that the cost now for ignition resistant material and construction methods is now equal to or less. And yeah. I actually built
on new buildings.
On new buildings, yeah. Well, if you're retrofitting, you're adding cost to an already existing house anyway. So that's added insurance that you're using. But I did build a small structure, and I was down at the lumber yard, and the wood siding versus the hardy board siding, it was significantly less. So metal mullion windows are significant. Vinyl and metal window mullions are significantly less than wood. Anyway, I wanted to just cite that correction. She didn't cite the CPAW report for some reason. But I think so. Currently, Portola Valley and these amendments makes Portola Valley the only town that has adopted much more, I might describe, stringent building code issues, components than any other jurisdiction. I do not think the county of San Mateo is entertaining this idea at all. I'm not sure if the town of Woodside or any other towns or cities that have very high fire severity zones in them, or even just high, are thinking about adopting more stringent. But to me, the roof material is super important. The decking material is super important. And so is the wood siding, as you build it, applying to the ground level. I think the first story being non-combustible is probably much more important than the second story, unless there's hips and different kind of roof designs that allow debris to collect against wood siding. And Portola Valley decided to just do, no wood, because the hardy board shingle looks just like wood. So you can create that same, and you don't have to maintain it. So you're not using toxic chemicals to restain your wood and reseal your wood, which, Don, how many spontaneously
that leads to another problem, right?
Yeah. So spontaneous combustion due to stains and the paints and oils. I mean, for a while there, it was the #1 ignition source.
We were going to those kinds of fires all the time. That was the main one that year.
Yeah. It was. So you lose, you don't have to use those chemicals, which is, you're being environmentally proactive, and it's also a sustainability issue. So, okay, is there any raised hands? I don't see anything in the chat. I do know that Portola Valley is gonna, Don is gonna lobby. Don is a professional lobbyist now.
Yes.
Just like at the state
level.
That
way.
And he's going to lobby the town to hopefully add a few more things. Might be good to have the ember intrusion, events that prohibit ember intrusion instead of just
I already have a list of things that we want to do. We want to take, one of the things we want to do is take the 50% rule which right now the wall areas, right now the wall area, you have to do both sides, right? So like we talked about being able to see through the wall. What I'd like to do on the next go around is make it so that a single side of wall removal captures the project. So if you're just doing a single side, you don't have to do both sides. It's going to capture the project as a new building and trigger the new building.
Right, right.
Another one is there is an exception on the roof eaves where if it's at a certain height and it sticks out, it doesn't need to be protected. I want any roof eaves that are sticking out. They all need to be protected with a non-combustible material. All vents should be WUI vents. Right now, there's one exception to the rule, and I want to do away with that exception so that all vents have to be WUI vents. I want wall assemblies should be rated as non-combustible assemblies rather than just non-combustible materials. So we want to get the assemblies part in there. I want to get the internal sprinklering of agricultural buildings and telecommunication buildings included in the sprinklering. And I want all ADUs to be sprinklered. So those are things that I'm shooting for the future code update.
Okay, great. Well, you have to keep us
yeah, I will.
updated. So we do have a couple questions raised hands. David from Hillsborough.
Can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
I'm just curious, offhand, what would be a non-combustible surface of a deck?
Well, there's different products, Dave. TimberTech, Hardy Board. There's all kinds of them now.
Stone.
So if you, yeah,
tile.
Yeah, tile, lightweight concrete.
To an existing deck, for example, you said Hardy Board. What was the other one you mentioned?
Well, TimberTech comes to mind, but there's other
Trex.
ones as well. Trex, that's right, Trex.
I see. Okay.
I just did a wood. I have a very high deck. It's probably 15 feet off the ground, and it was redwood, old redwood, 20-year-old deck, and I switched it to TimberTech. So when I went to the local lumber yard, actually I went to the decking store in San Jose. So I'll be very specific, and I priced redwood and I priced TimberTech. The TimberTech was substantially less. I got a good price on the TimberTech. I knew I was going to do TimberTech anyway, or a non-combustible, and so it was a great price. So you don't have to paint it, stain it, or anything like that. And I was able to use my existing framing. It was 16-inch on center, the joist, and so it worked great. So no more staining my deck and not having to worry anymore about embers landing on my deck. So
since we're on the subject of decks real quick, I'd like to throw something out there. When we proposed these code changes, I was thinking about the enclosure of decks. My reasoning was for 4 feet and lower is that it's very difficult for a homeowner to get underneath there and clear out the dead vegetative material that collects under the deck. Pine needles, leaves, those kinds of things. So if those get under the deck with an open deck, that the embers are going to get under there as well. And if there's a collection of fuel under there that it's going to ignite and it's going to, of course, heat rises, it's going to catch the deck on fire. And if the deck's connected to the house is the next step, right? It's going that way. So I thought, yeah, because it's difficult for people to get under the deck and clear out the vegetation and the dead material, let's enclose it. Let's enclose it with something solid so that the embers can't get in there and also the debris can't get in there. Now, what are your thoughts on decks that are 15 feet up, that it's not a problem for somebody to get underneath there, clear it out, keep your combustible storage out from underneath the deck? Do you think it's practical to have to enclose a deck that's 15 feet up in the air? I mean, because I know, especially if it's situated close to a slope, it's a heat trap. But it's also going to be that whatever that enclosure is that you enclose that deck with, whether it's combustible or non-combustible, it's also going to be exposed to that heat as well. I'm just curious. I'm trying to figure out the practicality of doing that.
Can I interject? The town says specifically Trex is not acceptable. So I would wonder about this other board you talk about, Denise. Anything that's plastic in it will not work. It will burn.
Well, it'll fail, but it doesn't combust.
Trex does.
It'll
Trex
melt, but
the town does not permit Trex.
Yeah, I don't know why they don't. It's on the, I believe it's on the State Fire Marshal's website for Chapter 7A. So,
Yeah, it is.
Yeah. So, I mean, we can put a list on the Fire Safe website, but the lumber yards have all kinds of samples. I mean, and we've done a lot of presentations where we bring the samples. There's all kinds of them. So, I think, Don, your question, I think that's too high to enclose. There's no need to enclose it.
Yeah.
All you're trying to do is prevent embers from accumulating under a deck where a homeowner can't get to them, right?
Well, that was my thought. But then, you know, in discussions that I've had with other people, you know, you look at, I don't know if you've ever seen the Reno fire on Melanie Lane, where you watch the fire come up a hillside that was basically, you know, a bunch of chaparral. It goes up the hillside, and then right at the top of the hillside is a bunch of houses with decks. Those decks go up in minutes, but they're, you know, they're 8-10 feet up off the ground.
Yeah.
But you know that that's a heat trap, but you also know that if you have that kind of fire coming up a hill at that intensity, I don't know how much non-combustible is going to help.
Well, that's where your defensible space comes in, where you have to have both. You just can't have one.
Have both.
You have to have both, especially on those upslopes and in a chaparral area, for sure. So, Karen has a question.
My question is why not just go to Chapter 7A for all building throughout California? I mean, it seems like you've said it's not that much more expensive. It also seems like it would make it simpler for construction and, you know, and planning to just have one rule rather than think, oh, we can do that. We have to do Chapter 7A in Portola Valley, but we don't have to do it, you know, in downtown San Mateo. It seems like just to make it Chapter 7A everywhere would be simpler and safer.
Yeah, well, I think the new Chapter 7A Crystal was alluding to is going to cover a lot more areas, especially a lot more LRA areas. The map is going to be significantly different. The state severity map is going to be significantly different if it ever gets to us. And so we're going to be capturing a lot more. There are cities that have adopted that they're using 7A everywhere in their city, because there's always a defining line where the very high and the high starts and ends. And people were getting upset. It's like, well, why do I have to do 7A and my neighbor across the street doesn't? And so the city council said, you know, yeah, you're right. Let's just do 7A everywhere. And I know Woodside did that. Portola Valley did that. I'm not sure what other communities have done that. So, but yeah, I agree, Karen. It would be great. Okay, let's see. Do we have any other questions? Casey, do you see any other hands up? Terry.
Can you hear me?
Yes. Yes.
I was wondering if anyone has looked into, you know, a lot of these things like adding tempered windows or adding vents and hardy, or re-siding the house with hardy siding. Has anyone looked into maybe giving exceptions to the homeowners, either, you know, reducing the permit fees or not adding to the property tax increases after a remodel? That would probably help in terms of getting people to comply.
Yeah, incentives work. You're right, Terry. You know, we've been waiting. The state and the governor keeps talking about these home hardening grants, and we haven't seen them yet. Even Crystal alluded to that. Yeah, they potentially are coming down the pike. We just don't know in what form and who will be administering them. But I think potentially, I know the Portola Valley Wildfire Committee talked about some incentives, and I'm not sure what if they're going to be proposing any, but I think it is a good idea. I know cities and the county of San Mateo has done some of that with tree removals. Some of the hazard tree removals people are getting relief from permit fees, expensive permit fees to cut down hazard trees around their property. So it would make sense if you have a Class B or Class C roof and you're changing it to Class A, it would be great if the local building department would give you a break on that.
Yeah. So I guess we can write our state senators and see if we get something moving.
Well, or your local building and your local council person or supervisor. So, but yeah, that's a good idea. All right. Any other hands up? It's 11:44. I think this is the longest we've ever gone. I mean, this is a complicated subject, but
this isn't complicated. Wait till we start talking about structure separation. That becomes complicated.
Yeah. Well, to me, this is where the rubber meets the road. This is how you prevent your house from igniting. I think, FireSafe has been great about producing information on defensible space. We do a ton of that. And I think our members are very savvy on defensible space. But home hardening, we need to become, it's technical and we have to be more educated on it and utilize the newest technology and share it with each other. So Dawn's a great resource. I still understand the code. So if you have additional questions about it, feel free to email either one of us or reach out to your local fire marshal or even Crystal. She's great.
Yeah, Crystal's great. She always gets right back to you.
Yeah. So we don't, continuing on the agenda, I don't really have any updates. We'll have some updates on some of the bigger grants next month. Does anybody have any announcements or anything that they would like to end the meeting with? Any hands up?
It's Rich.
Hi, Rich.
Hey, just two things. I think we talked about them yesterday. Is everybody keep in mind we're always looking for input on new agenda items. Keep this thing going. Denise has been really pulling things out of her hat to keep these agendas packed. But if you guys have ideas, something that we want to talk about or hear about, we're always open to hear that. Send them to Denise. And then I think we also will be talking about the advisory committee that's been put together and how we're going to have meetings with that very soon. So that's going to get going. So a bunch of stuff coming up.
Yeah, hopefully it'll be a great year. We got some good grant projects and we keep applying for more, and we'll be engaging our advisory committee. We'll be putting out the chipper schedule. So look for all of that. Next month, our meeting is February 9th. And as long as they have their report complete, Rusty Day, one of our advisors, is helping organize them to present on their building separation experiments and report. So that's potentially what we have in the queue for a February meeting. Okay, well, with that said, if there's no other announcements, everybody have a great day, and we will see you on February 9th. Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Thanks.
Thanks, Denise. Have a good day.